outside representing parents of society, the losing economy, the community, the need addressing the facts and working on the parents.
In our CBS, that's our collective bargaining agreement, that's our union contract. So it comes with a seat. That's what people are not saying. I didn't make this up. I didn't just create.
Tiffany Henyard, once a dominant force in Dalton's political scene, now finds herself embroiled in a widening corruption investigation that is shaking her inner circle and beyond. Instead of making headlines for political achievements, she is facing mounting allegations of financial misconduct and abuse of power. Scrutiny over her questionable activities intensifies daily, and those who once stood by her, including close allies, are now turning against her at an alarming rate. Even her child's father is reportedly cooperating with authorities, providing information that could have serious repercussions for Tiffany's future. Federal investigators are said to be conducting a deep probe into her dealings, and individuals she once relied on for protection are now working with law enforcement to bring the truth to light. To understand how Tiffany's once unshakable world began to unravel, one must look back at the path she took to power, a journey fueled by ambition and reinforced by an image of invincibility that she carefully cultivated throughout her time in office. Tiffany surrounded herself with fiercely loyal allies. At least that's how it seemed. In reality, many of these individuals carried their own questionable reputations, forming a tangled web of enablers and scapegoats. She had carefully constructed a network of fall guys, believing they would take the blame if any wrongdoing came to light. But as the investigation into her shady dealings intensified, Tiffany found herself unable to outrun the mounting pressure. Once skilled at manipulating public perception and avoiding accountability, she was now losing control. Hoping to escape media scrutiny, Tiffany attempted to retreat, expecting the controversy to fade with time. However, with the FBI reportedly closing in, remaining in the shadows became impossible. The moment she tried to disappear, it became clear her grip on power was slipping. Those she once relied on were no longer willing to shield her from the consequences of her actions. One by one, her so-called protectors turned on her, and the empire she had built began to collapse. The most shocking betrayal came from her own partner, Kamal Woods. More than just a romantic companion, Kamal played a central role in Tiffany's business dealings, and his decision to cooperate with investigators delivered a devastating blow to her already crumbling defense. While he had long been portrayed as a loyal supporter, his willingness to work with authorities suggests that his involvement in Tiffany's alleged schemes was far more intricate than initially believed. Kamal was not merely a bystander in Tiffany's world, he was a key player. As the director of her cancer foundation, his position had already raised eyebrows. The Found Foundation, supposedly established to support breast cancer patients, is now under intense scrutiny. Investigators are questioning whether it was truly a charitable organization or simply a well-crafted publicity stunt. Suspicion grew when, on the very day the foundation was officially launched, it received a sizable donation, an event that only deepened speculation about its true purpose. As authorities delved into its financial records, concerns mounted that the foundation may have been a front for other, less charitable activities. With her support system crumbling and her once loyal allies turning against her, Tiffany now finds herself backed into a corner. Once viewed as untouchable, she is facing the harsh reality that her political empire may be on the brink of total collapse. Federal authorities are closing in, the public is demanding answers, and the pressure continues to mount, adding to her troubles. The investigation has uncovered alarming allegations of financial misconduct, particularly the misuse of public funds. Reports indicate that she funneled taxpayer money for personal and unauthorized expenses, further fueling the case against her. As the walls close in, one question remains: how much longer can Tiffany Henyard evade the consequences of her actions? Tiffany allegedly used taxpayer funds to finance a trip outside of Dalton to promote her foundation, effectively turning public money into a tool for advancing her personal agenda. Even more troubling, she is accused of using these funds to pay her employees, including Kamal Woods, who remained a central figure in her questionable dealings. Despite growing red flags, Tiffany continued funneling public money into her foundation, believing herself to be untouchable. But when federal authorities intervened, the situation took a dramatic turn. The feds arrived with a subpoena, demanding access to key financial records tied to her transactions. Kamal, who had been receiving a paycheck from Tiffany's dubious foundation, was soon exposed for securing a lucrative position in Thornton Township, where he earned a salary exceeding $100,000, an amount far beyond what most Dalton residents could ever hope for. The investigation took an unexpected twist when Kamal's name appeared in the subpoenas, signaling that authorities were widening their probe beyond Tiffany and into the financial activities of those closest to her. Tiffany herself was served, with 2 subpoenas, one of which targeted her private business dealings. Investigators uncovered a tangled web of enterprises that were just as murky as her political affairs. Among them were a restaurant and a property management firm, both of which raised serious concerns about their legitimacy. One particularly egregious case involved a tenant who lost their home in 2019 due to hazardous living conditions, including a mold-infested and leaking building, clear evidence that Tiffany's business practices were far from ethical. As the investigation deepens, the once unshakable foundation of Tiffany's empire is rapidly crumbling, and the consequences she, long managed to avoid, may finally be catching up to her. The investigation into Tiffany Henyard's affairs only continues to deepen, revealing an empire built on deceit and financial manipulation. Her dramatic downfall is made even more striking by the fact that those she once trusted to safeguard her interests are now actively assisting law enforcement in their pursuit of justice. Tiffany's long-standing pattern of cutting corners, abusing power, and prioritizing personal wealth over the well-being of her community is finally catching up to her in ways she never anticipated. She may have once believed herself invincible, but the mounting evidence suggests otherwise. With federal investigators closing in, her days of unchecked authority appear to be numbered. Perhaps the most shocking betrayal of all comes from her own child's father. Once seen as a dependable figure in her
damage, and then leaked one into my kitchen, and it's the window sill leaked in my daughter's.
Except they weren't. Enter activist David Lowry, who called Bolton directly. Suddenly, the house being livable on September 3rd became unfit for occupancy on October 15th. Lowry's theory?
As the investigation into Tiffany Henyard's alleged corruption intensified, more individuals stepped forward to expose her actions, a development she should have anticipated, given the controversy that had surrounded her administration from the very start. Just 6 months after taking over as supervisor of Thornton Township, the FBI began scrutinizing her operations, recognizing the need for a full understanding of her business dealings. Federal authorities formally requested all records related to her political fund, charity foundation, and township operations, signaling that her financial activities had been under intense scrutiny long before the investigation escalated. Even before the federal probe gained momentum, Tiffany was already facing growing dissent within her own ranks, particularly from members of her so-called Dream Team, a group she had personally selected to help her run the township. She likely assumed they would remain loyal and cooperative, but the reality proved far different. Trustees Tiana Beller and Jason House, along with village clerk Allison Key, were initially expected to be her closest allies. However, they quickly became some of her most vocal critics, refusing to ignore the unethical and questionable decisions she was making. What was supposed to be a united front in governance swiftly turned into a nightmare for Tiffany as her hand picked. Team began challenging her leadership and exposing her misconduct. Tensions escalated, and the trustees, originally chosen for their perceived loyalty, began working with the village board to take legal action against her, accusing her of serious conflicts of interest. Their primary concern was the mounting evidence that Tiffany was using her position not to serve the people of Dalton, but to advance her own personal and financial interests. This legal battle, which erupted just 6 months into her tenure, exposed the deep fractures within her administration and solidified the growing opposition against her. Rather than taking responsibility for her actions or addressing the concerns raised by the trustees, Tiffany retaliated in a desperate attempt to maintain control. She accused them of deliberately stirring controversy and working against her vision to make Dalton great. By doing so, she framed herself as a victim of a political witch hunt rather than an official under investigation for serious misconduct. However, this response only deepened the divide between her and her former allies, making it clear that she was unwilling to acknowledge any wrongdoing. Meanwhile, the federal investigation into her business dealings continued to escalate, further eroding what little credibility she had left. With her administration unraveling and the walls closing in, Tiffany Henyard's grip on power appeared more fragile than ever. With the FBI scrutinizing every aspect of her political fund and charity foundation, Tiffany Henyard found it increasingly difficult to maintain the carefully constructed facade of legitimacy. The investigation soon expanded to the township's finances, raising even more questions about how public funds were being managed under her leadership. What had begun as whispers of corruption quickly escalated into an undeniable storm of allegations, as more individuals stepped forward to reveal the truth about her administration. The turning point came when even Tiffany's staunchest supporters began publicly distancing themselves from her, recognizing the severe legal consequences of remaining aligned with her. Once seen as untouchable, Tiffany now watched her empire unravel before her eyes. Every attempt to silence her critics only backfired, reinforcing the perception that she was more focused on self-preservation than on serving the township she had been elected to lead. The lawsuit filed by the trustees further solidified the growing belief that Tiffany's administration was riddled with conflicts of interest. As legal battles mounted, it became increasingly clear that she was running out of options. What had once seemed like an unstoppable rise to power was now transforming into a slow but inevitable downfall, driven by her own actions and the unwillingness of those around her to continue shielding her. The deeper the investigation went, the more evident it became that Tiffany's leadership was built on a foundation of corruption, manipulation, and self-serving decisions. Her refusal to take responsibility, coupled with her aggressive retaliation against anyone who opposed her, only hastened her collapse. The very people she had relied on to protect her were now among those working to hold her accountable. With federal authorities determined to uncover the full extent of her misdeeds and former allies turning against her, Tiffany Henyard's political career appeared to be in its final chaotic chapter. As the investigation gained momentum, her tactics became increasingly desperate, but the walls were closing in, and this time, there was no escape. Growing darker and more authoritarian, Tiffany Henyard took drastic measures to maintain control, barring trustees from their offices in an attempt to intimidate them. But rather than backing down, the trustees stood their ground, determined to remove her. They even held meetings without her involvement, an act that some might have questioned, yet it was a reflection of just how deeply her leadership had failed. Dalton. Under Tiffany's rule, the town was crumbling, both figuratively and literally. Roads deteriorated, homes fell into neglect, and the police force remained underfunded and poorly equipped. Yet, rather than addressing these urgent issues, Tiffany continued to squander public funds on frivolous expenses. Before she took office, Dalton had been a town that prioritized community well-being, focusing on improvements for its residents. But under her administration, everything became about Tiffany. Any event that didn't directly promote her or enhance her image was either canceled or deliberately undermined. One of the most blatant examples of her self-serving governance was her reckless spending. Tiffany used taxpayer money for massive billboards, plastered with her face, first-class flights, luxury stays at upscale hotels like the Four Seasons, high-profile DJs, professional photographers, and even a dedicated security team for her personal protection. Each expense made it increasingly clear her focus was not on serving the people of Dalton, but on elevating her own status. Her disregard for the community became even more apparent when she actively obstructed a long-standing initiative meant to benefit the town. Instead of supporting efforts to improve infrastructure and resources, she chose to consolidate power, silencing opposition and diverting funds to serve her own interests. As her grip tightened and the walls closed in, it became undeniable. Tiffany Henyard's reign was not just corrupt, it was a calculated abuse of power, and its days were numbered. That her image remained front and center. Even as Dalton's roads crumbled, vital services went underfunded, and the town faced urgent crises, Tiffany spared no expense in bolstering her own reputation. One of the most egregious examples of her self-obsession came when she deliberately sabotaged a beloved annual community event, simply because it did not revolve around her. The event, a long-standing tradition in Dalton, was set to take place as planned, but Tiffany refused to grant permission for the use of the public park. Her reason? She had scheduled her own competing event just a few miles away and did not want anything detracting from it. In a stunning display of pettiness and authoritarian control, she ordered massive cement blocks to be placed at the entrance of the park, physically preventing residents from attending their own community gathering. This blatant act of obstruction revealed the lengths Tiffany was willing to go to protect her personal image, even at the expense of the people who had entrusted her with public office. Her leadership continuously reinforced the perception that she was more concerned with maintaining her power than with serving Dalton. What had once been a political career filled with promises of progress and change was now an administration, driven by self-glorification, retaliation, and corruption. Instead of working to improve the town, Tiffany became fixated on crushing opposition, consolidating control, and ensuring that she alone remained in the spotlight. The trustees, realizing that her reign had become a liability to Dalton, were left with no choice but to take action. Behind the scenes, they strategized ways to limit her influence and, ultimately, remove her from power. With each passing month, Tiffany's actions continued to expose her true priorities: self-promotion, reckless financial decisions, and ruthless retaliation against anyone who dared to challenge her. But as her grip on power loosened, the cracks in her carefully constructed facade became impossible to ignore. What had once seemed like an unstoppable political force was now unraveling, and those who had once feared her were no longer willing to stay silent. Tiffany had remained in the public eye, using taxpayer dollars to construct an image of grandeur rather than addressing the real concerns of her community. What had once been seen as a promising new chapter for Dalton quickly unraveled into a cautionary tale of unchecked ego, financial irresponsibility, and political manipulation. As the investigation into her administration gained momentum, her critics' voices grew louder. It became increasingly clear that Tiffany Henyard was not a leader invested in her community, but rather a politician consumed by self-interest, using every available resource to fortify her public image at the expense of the very people she was elected to serve. One of the most public incidents that illustrated her egotistical approach to governance came when she abruptly canceled an annual car show organized by local resident Bosley. The event, held in the parking lot of Neo Park in Dalton, had become a beloved community tradition. Bosley had paid $11,000 to the park district for the necessary permit, only to receive a call from Tiffany's top assistant just days before the event, informing him that the show was being shut down. The assistant suggested that if Bosley moved the event to Tiffany's preferred location on Greenwood, it could proceed without issue, an offer he took as a thinly veiled threat. When he arrived at Neo Park on the morning of the event, he found massive concrete barricades blocking the entrance, with Dalton police threatening to tow any cars that attempted to park there. To many in the community, This was a clear indication that Tiffany would go to extreme lengths to ensure that her own self-promotional spectacle was not overshadowed by a local gathering. The car show cancellation was just one of many examples of how Tiffany's leadership revolved around personal gain rather than the well-being of her constituents. But as outrageous as her actions were, they paled in comparison to other scandals that had unfolded during her tenure. Recently, yet another insider, Carmen Carril, came forward to expose Tiffany's manipulative tactics. In a public statement, Carril revealed that over the past 2 years, Tiffany had engaged in a pattern of deception, retaliation, and financial mismanagement, further solidifying the case against her. Accessible to the people, and had championed initiatives that directly benefited the community. However, their loyalty was increasingly tested as mounting evidence painted a damning picture of her administration's rampant corruption and self-serving leadership. Tiffany Henyard had systematically manipulated staff, vendors, and residents to consolidate her power and maintain an iron grip on the township. This revelation confirmed what many had long suspected. She was not a leader working for the betterment of Dalton, but a politician exploiting her position for personal gain. Despite the mounting allegations and an escalating federal investigation, Tiffany refused to take responsibility for her actions. Instead, she attempted to deflect blame onto her right-hand man, Keith Freeman, claiming that if anyone should be held accountable for corruption, financial mismanagement, and abuse of power, it was him. This desperate attempt to shift responsibility was widely viewed as a last-ditch effort to save herself as the walls closed in. Henyard had long projected an image of polished leadership and success, but in reality, her rise had been built on the backs of hard-working taxpayers from Thornton Township and the village of Dalton. As investigators peeled back the layers of her administration, it became clear that her well-crafted public persona was nothing more than an illusion, maintained through intimidation, manipulation, and reckless spending. Meanwhile, Keith Freeman, once Tiffany's closest and most trusted ally, found himself entangled in legal trouble of his own. Charged with fraud in a separate FBI probe, his indictment further confirmed the widespread corruption within Henyard's administration. The irony of Tiffany attempting to distance herself from Freeman while he was already facing legal scrutiny was not lost on the public. People had grown weary of her repeated attempts to dodge accountability, and the scandal only reinforced the perception that her leadership had been a self-serving enterprise from the start. As more insiders came forward with damning information about her conduct, it became increasingly evident that Tiffany's political empire had been built on deception. The trust she demanded from her staff, the loyalty she expected from her allies, and the support she counted on from her constituents had all eroded, leaving her increasingly isolated. No longer able to hide behind a carefully manufactured image, she was being forced to confront the reality of her actions. The ongoing federal investigation ensured that every fraudulent transaction, every misuse of taxpayer dollars, and every abuse of power was being meticulously examined. It was only a matter of time before Tiffany faced the full consequences of her misconduct. For years, she had manipulated the system to serve her own interests, but as the truth came to light and those closest to her abandoned her one by one, it became clear that her reign was reaching its inevitable and dramatic conclusion. In an effort to defend Tiffany, her criminal defense attorney, Bo Brinley, placed the blame squarely on Freeman, arguing that he had been responsible for financial decisions. Brinley contended that Tiffany, as a new mayor, had trusted Freeman's guidance and was unaware that using taxpayer funds for first-class flights, luxury accommodations at the Four Seasons, and excessive spending on self-promotion was improper. According to Brinley, Freeman had assured her that these expenses were acceptable. However, despite this defense, many saw through Tiffany's attempts to